In this developer video tutorial, I'm going to explain how to properly handle any type of errors that may occur when you are trying to use the Pummel Head API. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to show you how to basically listen for when the Pummel Head API has successfully loaded. This is a very important, although optional step. I would really highly recommend that you do not execute any type of actual game code until the Pummel Head API has fully initialized. Although, as I said, this is optional and not necessary. Completely necessary because the Pummel Head API does load pretty fast. It's still probably important for you to only fire off your code and initialize everything once the Pummel Head API itself has successfully initialized. So to do that, we're going to actually use the two optional parameters that are inside of the init function. So the first one is called success. So I'm gonna just right now create a fake variable called on success, and then one called on failure. Now this one right here takes an object of type function. And this is basically we're just going to pass in a reference of a function that we're going to create in a second called onSuccess, and this function will be fired as soon as the Pummel Head API has successfully initialized. Then we're going to do kind of the same thing we did with this, but when the Pummel Head API fails to initialize. So we're going to create another function called onFailure that will be fired if the Pummel Head API fails to successfully completely initialize. So let's create these two functions real quick. So the public function on success, and then let's create the other function, public function on failure. Okay, cool, ready to go. So we can just do a little comment here, like saying, this is where the game code would execute. And then here on failure, we can just do a little comment here that would say, this is when we would show a message saying fail to connect Pummel Head. Okay, so basically what's going to happen here is that when the Pummel Head library initiates successfully, it's going to fire this function right here, and which in turn is going to fire off any type of logic that we put inside of here. In this case, based on this comment, we're just basically saying we're going to actually, start up the game and then start playing. And then we did another function called onFailure. So when the Pummel Head library does not initiate successfully, it will fire off this function and any logic we put inside of here. And in this particular case, we just put a little fakey comment in here saying that we're going to show a message to the player saying we failed to connect to Pummel Head. This way, by setting up the code this way, we are making sure that we're not going to just keep pushing through, even though the Pummel Head library may have failed. And you don't want to get in a situation where the library failed to load and you're making lots of calls trying to submit scores and check for tournament information, and it's just, you're just getting back null information, and your scores aren't being submitted to the server successfully, so on and so forth. Now, that's the safety net you can put into place for when you're initializing the library. But what if the Pummel Head library has successfully initialized, but one of the actual calls themselves are failing? So let's just say we want to listen for an error that happens during one of those calls. So to do that, the first thing we need to do is we actually need to import another library from Flash events event dispatcher. The event dispatcher object basically allows you to listen for particular events. So we're just going to create a new public var event dispatcher. Okay, now we create a global event dispatcher object so we can use it all across our functions. We now need to set it to the event dispatcher object that the Pummel Head library returns back. Now, the Pummel Head library, a init function, will always, no matter what, even if it fails or succeeds or whatever, will return back an event dispatcher object. See, it's an event dispatcher. And this will allow us to then listen for a whole bunch of events for that the Pummel Head API will dispatch as it's as you're executing certain function calls and so on and so forth. So what we actually need to do is we need to import one more library, class. It's called the events package. It's called Pummel Head event. Pummel Head event contains all the different types of events you can execute and returns back information about what happened. Okay, cool. Now that we have our event dispatcher object, we need to add an event listener on it so we can listen for a particular error. Dispatcher, we do add event listener, and we do Pummel Head event. And as you can see, these are all the different types of events you can listen for that the Pummel Head library will dispatch based off of certain conditions. So we have the end game session event. We have the reset game, score submitted, init complete, so on and so forth. But the one we'll listen for is error. So on Pummel Head error. And then we need to create another function called on head error. And it's going to pass back a Pummel Head event object. And perfect. What's going to happen is that during the system, if anything goes wrong when we're trying to submit a score or end a game player's session, whatever, it will fire off this function right here because we are now listening for an error event to be dispatched. And as soon as that error event is dispatched, if you look inside of the event object, it will give back properties so you can report information to the admins or send information to the player, so on and so forth. There are a couple. There is message. Message will basically give you back information about what went wrong. A very clean message, like saying, could not submit score, so on and so forth. And then there's also code, which will give you back just a code, a number that represents the error that happened. This is more useful for sending it to an admin. And then there's also internal code. Internal code is it's like a more complicated number that will only make sense to an administrator or a developer on Pummel Head. So if something really goes wrong and you're testing your game, you probably want to give this code to the admin. And then there's internal message, which is a really cryptic message that would come back from the servers that you'd only want to use, never show it to the user, but only want to use it for debugging purposes so that you could send this information to an administrator on the Pummel Head website. And those are really the only things you need to know about. And that is really it when it comes to listening for different types of events. In this particular case, an error when the Pummel Head API is being used. But as you saw about a minute ago, there are different types of events you can listen for. Like there's score submitted. So every time a score is submitted, you can make it so it'll dispatch. When it dispatches that event, you can make it so it'll fire off a certain function and so on and so forth. But that is essentially all you really need to do for the setup when it comes to listening for different types of events and errors when you're using the Pummel Head API. So that's it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching.